item of business is Stage 1 debate on motion 23648 in the name of Graham Day on the Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill. Would those who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Graham Day to speak to and move the motion for up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Whilst this bill is on an accelerated timetable, it is the result of extensive consultation and has been developed together with electoral professionals and representatives of all the parties in this Parliament. And I am extremely grateful for the constructive approach of everyone involved. Let me also sincerely thank the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee for its scrutiny of the bill and Stage 1 report. The staging of the committee's evidence-taking sessions was impressive, to say the least. Presiding Officer, clearly the pandemic has impacted all aspects of life. We must assume that it might have significant implications still for the 2021 Scottish Parliament election. Whilst progress with the vaccines is encouraging, in truth, no one can be certain what the public health situation will be in May, nor can we be sure of the attitude of the public to voting in a traditional manner. However, our electoral community has already successfully delivered 8 local government by-elections this autumn, and it has been assisted by guidance regularly updated by the Electoral Management Board and informed by discussions with Public Health Scotland. It's important that we now complement these practical steps with appropriate legislation. Firstly, to make sure that voters are able to vote safely in person, but also have the option to vote by post or proxy if they wish. And secondly, to take responsible action for a worst-case scenario where it would not be possible to hold the election on the 6th of May. Briefly.
Neil Finlay.
Just before the Minister gets into all the detail, does he think in general in Scotland that we are good at engaging the electorate in the democratic process?
Graham Day.
I'm sure we could do better, but I think in general we are. Presiding Officer, the bill is a dedicated response to the pandemic, and it does not make any permanent changes to electoral law. Having heard evidence from a range of electoral professionals, the Standards Committee have welcomed the proposals contained within this bill, but they've rightly sought also to explore some aspects further. And I welcome this afternoon's debate as an opportunity to do that. And I want to summarise some of the key components of the bill. Presiding Officer, we must ensure that Parliament is able to postpone next May's election if the risk to the public health makes that course of action necessary. Dissolution is currently due on the 25th of March. After that point, Parliament could not be recalled for any reason. The bill therefore seeks to modify the dissolution period for the Parliament to commence on the 5th of May, the day before the planned date of the election. This will permit Parliament to meet to legislate for a new polling date if this is required, and also ensures that it can continue to meet if a postponement were to occur. This change would mean that we all retain our status as MSPs until the day before the election. As a result, new guidance will be issued by the corporate body to cover conduct issues, and I thank Scottish Parliament officials for this ongoing work. The change to the dissolution arrangements means that this Parliament can meet to postpone the election if that were to be required. However, as a further contingency measure, the bill gives the presiding officer a power to postpone the election by up to 6 months. Let me stress that this is intended only as a last resort. For the presiding officer to postpone the election for a reason related to the coronavirus, he must be satisfied that Parliament could not meet safely to legislate to change the date of the poll. This power also covers things like catastrophic IT failure or a terror attack. Turning to polling day itself, physical distancing in polling stations means that in-person voting could take longer than normal. This bill empowers ministers to provide for polling to occur over more than one day and allows any additional polling days to be within the period of 8 days following the 6th of May. If extra days were needed, electoral professionals advise that the best approach would be for voting to take place on Thursday and then Friday. Malcolm Burr, the convener of the Electoral Management Board, has this week provided, at my request, advice on the merits of a second day of polling. The EMB has analysed projected voter numbers and the impact of physical distancing in light of the experience of recent government by-elections. Mr Burr has concluded that it would be preferable to proceed on the basis of one day of polling, albeit alongside some additional measures. My intention is to follow that advice and to continue to heed the EMB's expertise as we proceed. However, in light of concerns raised at stage 1, I am though minded to bring forward an amendment so that provision for any additional days of polling would be dependent upon a recommendation from the EMB. I will also bring forward an amendment requiring ministers to provide a statement of reasons for any such move. It is to be expected, John Scott.
John Scott,
on that point, Minister, do you not think that it would be appropriate to, for Parliament to be consulted in that regard, and therefore there should be an affirmative instrument if there were a need for a second day?
Graham Day.
Mr Scott, as you will appreciate, this is a fast-evolving situation. The advice was provided yesterday. At this stage, I'm not minded as such, but as you know, my door is always open, and I'm happy to engage with you both today in the debate and beyond that. Presiding Officer, it's expected there will be a substantial increase in applications for postal votes as a result of the pandemic. To understand voter intentions, the Scottish Government asked the Electoral Commission to conduct 2 opinion polls on attitudes to voting, both in August and then in November. Both surveys, interestingly, found that around 77% of eligible electors would feel safe voting in person at a polling place, provided there were appropriate hygiene measures and physical distancing in place. However, they also found that 38% of respondents would apply to vote by post if encouraged to do so. Now, currently, only 18% of the electorate are registered for a postal vote. Increasing that figure to around 40% will involve processing of around 900,000 postal vote applications. Now, whilst the rollout of vaccines may result in fewer applications, we must still prepare for a significant increase. This will place a substantial pressure on electoral registration officers and their staff. Therefore, the bill will bring forward the deadline for postal vote applications to the 6th of April. Now, I accept this is not ideal. It does appear to run counterintuitive to attempting to maximise uptake of postal votes. But on the basis of clear advice from the electoral professionals, it is a pragmatic and necessary step, and I think the committee recognised that in their report. Making this change will help ensure that increased numbers of postal votes can be processed in time for the election. Such a substantial increase needs to be properly resourced, of course, and the Scottish Government will provide £3 million in additional resource to the EROs to support this work. EROs have developed plans to manage higher numbers, contingency plans, and further resource is also under consideration to cope with any anticipated surge in applications that they receive closer to this deadline. An all-postal election could not be held until late 2021 at the earliest. The bill does allow ministers to provide for a rearranged election to be held on an all-postal basis. But although postal voting is valuable, it has downsides. The Electoral Management Board considered it likely that a large number of people simply would not engage with an all-postal election, would therefore effectively be disenfranchised. An all-postal vote, therefore, is a contingency only, to be deployed in the event that the public health situation was very significantly worse than is currently the case. The committee recommended that the power for ministers to legislate in an all-postal vote be subject to a higher degree of parliamentary scrutiny. I agree. I intend to bring forward an amendment at stage 2 to make use of this power subject to the affirmative procedure. The Commission's public awareness campaign will run across So sitting alongside all of this, we intend to have a full public awareness raising campaign around postal votes, because we think it's essential for people in two regards to have a better understanding. One, of the process to apply, and secondly, to have confidence in the nature of the process, because there is a lot of misunderstanding of how postal votes work. The Commission's public awareness campaign will run across TV, digital and radio, and will also include the delivery of an information booklet to all households in Scotland. In addition, we must direct specific activity towards voters who might feel they're at a higher risk of the effects of COVID-19, and in doing this, we will engage with the relevant public health expertise. The Government, as the committee heard, will write directly to 169,000 people of voting age in the shielding category to draw their attention to their options. Presiding Officer, my hope, indeed expectation, is that much of the content of this bill will not be needed. The people of Scotland continue to make daily sacrifices to suppress the virus, and the news of vaccines has given us all cause for optimism. However, this bill provides important measures if the virus poses significant risks in May next year. I thank the committee for their engagement and look forward to this afternoon's debate. And, Presiding Officer, I move that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill.
Thank you very much. I'm going to change the normal order of speakers on this occasion. So we'll now go to Miles Briggs for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The coronavirus public health emergency has impacted on every part of our lives, and the democratic life of the nation is no different. The ability to hold a safe Scottish Parliament election next year, while social distancing restrictions may still be in place, and for voters to be able to participate safely and confidently is extremely important. Although it's clear that the planned election in May is likely to be unlike any previous election, especially for campaigning purposes, it's important that we make sure that we can hold a safe election and that we can also count the results, and this Parliament can meet as soon as possible. This includes ensuring that voters have clear and comprehensive information in advance about the options available to help them plan how to safely vote. We welcome the news this week of the commencing COVID-19 vaccination campaign, and it is a huge step forward, as we heard at First Minister's questions, that 5,330 of our fellow Scots have already received the vaccine. Let us hope that come March we'll be in a much more positive place, where we can remove social distancing measures which have been needed to date. And it's worth reflecting that during the pandemic, we've seen elections take place in Canada, New Zealand and the US, as well as 8 local council by-elections across the country. I believe there's considerable learning from these countries who have held these national elections, and how Scotland can take forward to assure voters that we're conducting a safe election and count. The pandemic has placed significant pressures, as we all know, on our local authorities, and I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute and thank all those in local government who've worked incredibly hard to support our communities throughout the pandemic, especially in the councils which I represent across the Lothian region. The Scottish General Election Bill is important to help achieve a safe election and try to plan for any eventualities. And that's why we have been engaging positively across party to try to make sure we do just that. Section 5 and 8 of the bill currently present a number of concerns for us relating to the powers which they provide to ministers, and my colleagues later on in the debate will outline more specifically on that point. But I welcome the positive signal today from the Minister in his letter to the committee that the Scottish Government accepts the committee's reasoning and will prepare a Stage 2 amendment to apply the affirmative procedure to the use of these powers outlined in Section 5. We believe this should also be the case in relation to Section 8, and I note the Minister has responded in the debate today already to state that the Government is considering this, and a possible amendment will be brought forward. And I note the advice from the convener today of the Electoral Management Board. I think that's a positive contribution to make sure we do actually all agree how that can be taken forward. Scottish Conservatives do believe that amendment is important to ensure that no such order-making power can be exercised other than with the assent of this Parliament under the affirmative procedure. Now, as we progress to Stage 2, we'll be seeking assurances in order to strengthen the Parliament's position and increase government accountability. As the Electoral Commission say in their useful briefing ahead of today's debate, there are a number of concerns still relating to the bill. The proposal in the bill to provide for an earlier deadline for applications to vote by post would reduce the time available for electors to make applications to vote by post. In particular, it would mean that anyone applying to register to vote after the 6th of April would, before the 19th of April registration deadline, would not be able to access this method for voting in that May election. Now, I believe that risks being contrary to what we're all trying to achieve, and the objective of applying to vote by post should be as simple and accessible for all voters. And we have a few number of concerns with regards to the postal vote administration process as outlined currently. I believe any public information campaign or an application process for this should be independent of the Scottish Government and administered by local authorities, and I hope we'll receive assurances on that as well as we progress to Stage 2. If the Scottish Parliament elections scheduled for May 2021 is likely to be delivered against the backdrop of evolving public health restrictions, then we must work to guarantee that no one is disenfranchised. And I note the change in voter behaviour which was outlined in the Electoral Management Board's response. We know that many citizens, especially those who have been asked to shield during the pandemic, may be concerned about voting, and therefore we must ensure potential changes do not cause confusion for them as well. We've also seen evidence of change in voter behaviour during the council by-elections which have been taking place. With more people working from home, the past pinch points which we would see at polling stations and queues in the morning, for example, and after work, have been replaced with a potential lunchtime peak in voting. So I think how we see voter behaviour changing and in that potential election is important. And all these issues, I believe, should be considered as we go forward. So to conclude, Deputy Presiding Officer, we all hope that the provisions included in the Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill will not actually be needed, and that by the end of March, the potential election date for May can be held as normal as possible, and that Scottish Parliament elections can proceed. It is responsible for Parliament to take steps to make sure that democratic elections can take place safely and that Parliament, if needed, can be recalled. Scottish Conservatives will support the bill at stage 1 this evening and look forward to working to find a consensus on all these issues I've outlined at stage 2. Thank you.
Anna Sarwar, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Deputy Presiding Officer, next year's elections will take place under circumstances nobody could ever have imagined, and certainly not any that any of us would want. Our first and top priority must be to make sure that it's an election that's safe for voters and safe for poll workers as well. But it's also an opportunity to drive up the turnout. I think we've seen elsewhere. I mean, I'm not saying there's perfect lessons to learn from the US about their electoral process, but certainly one of the positives that came from it was the extraordinary levels of turnout, despite being in the midst of a pandemic. That should be something that we aspire to here in Scotland as well. And on that basis, I think it is important that this is a bill that is done by consensus, not in contention. And I know that is certainly the intention of the Minister from my discussions in private with him, but also I'm sure from the engagement we'll have through this parliamentary process as well. Just from the outset, though, two points of clarification. I think, I hope we can avoid the need for an all-postal ballot, and I think we all want to avoid the need to delay an election. But I think as part of this, we should set a clear framework for what would need to happen if that decision was to be taken, so there is some certainty for the electorate and those that are administering the election. And the second point on the cost, I welcome what the Minister has said around the extra £3 million for the EROs. Although within the financial framework that has been published today, there is a suggestion that the cost for a hybrid election could actually be an additional £5 million for the ERO. So just some clarification about whether the full budget will be given to them for that full £5 million. As I say, there is largely consensus, but I wanted to pick up on 4 or 5 issues, if I may, with the Minister that I hope we can get agreement on in the next 2 stages of the bill. The first one is I welcome the public information campaign. I think that's important, but the speed of it and the early start of it, I think, is also really important, because that in itself can perhaps negate some of the challenges that there is in terms of the bringing forward the earlier postal vote deadline. And just on that, I do think it is counterintuitive for us to be bringing the postal vote deadline application forward when we're trying to encourage more people to be applying. So I actually think if you have a fully functional public information campaign, you get the booklets out early enough, and you provide the opportunity to make it easy for people applying early enough, you then perhaps negate the risk of that massive flow of applications in those final 2 weeks. So if you do that, you can actually probably keep the deadline as it is, rather than bring the deadline forward. So I would ask the Minister to please consider that again, because I do think there is a worry about bringing the deadline further forward. And if it means additional resources required for the EROs, I think we should look at those additional resources. On the postal votes, also I think there should be a free post application. No one should have to pay to get a vote, so there should be universal free post applications to be able to apply for a postal vote. I know that there's been the suggestion that political parties can offer free posts for applications. I think that's something that we should resist. It should be something I think that is there available for all. And I'll take some clarification from the Minister in his closing about whether his own party is perhaps planning to do a free post application for postal vote applications, when it should be something that's universal for all. Because as I say, cost should never be a barrier for someone to be able to apply for a vote. I'm also concerned about the number of polling days. So I accept that we hope that the vaccine is suitably spread across the population, that we do not need a socially distanced election. But if we do need a socially distanced election, then I do think we should have the option of having additional voter days. My preference for that would be at least 2 days rather than just 1 day, but I accept that can be a decision that can be made closer to the time, although I would say that should be a decision for the Parliament to make rather than for the government to make. I don't think political parties here would want to do something that they thought was against advice, so it should be primarily for Parliament to make that decision, not for the government to make that decision. I also welcome what the Minister said about the letters going out, particularly to the shielded group. I think that is welcome. I do think, though, that those letters should not be coming from the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government is a participant in the election. They're not a neutral in the election. So I think any letters, if I've got the time, Deputy President.
Graham Day, quickly, please.
A bit of clarity there. Subject to his agreement, I would intend that that correspondence would come from the Chief Medical Officer, not from Scottish Government officials or whatever. And the reason it would come from the Chief Medical Officer is because he has been the point of contact for the shielding group throughout this process. And by way of further clarification, any wording for such a letter would be agreed with the Electoral Commission in advance.
I welcome that for the Minister, but I still do think that there is a contention about how the branding of that is done. If it's an NHS Scotland letter, that's a very different place to be than if it was a Scottish Government letter. So I think we should be very clear it should not be a Scottish Government letter, and any such letter should include an application, and it should also include a free post application, because, as I say, there are participants in the election, not a neutral body. But in closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, the key point I want to make here is that we've all got to have collective trust in the electoral process, and I think it is really, really important that this bill passes with consensus and not with contention. On that principle, I'm happy to work with the Minister and indeed every other political party in this chamber to make sure we can achieve that consensus.
Now call Patrick Harvey for up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Others have already said that in these extraordinary circumstances, we should all be seized of the priority of ensuring that our election can be carried out in a safe as well as a safe manner, as well as a way in which people can have confidence in the process. None of us, I think, would welcome the idea of a delay, but I think we need to be conscious of the fact that if our election had fallen due in May this year instead of May next year, I think it's a pretty clear scenario that we would have had to delay it in those circumstances. We're all hopeful that May 2021 will be a lot better position in terms of the COVID outbreak than we were in May this year, or indeed since. But we simply don't know the situation that we'll face in May, and that's why we do need legislation that is open to a range of different scenarios, that is able to ensure that our election can take place safely and that we can have confidence in it in a range of those different scenarios. That's one of the reasons why I'm cautious about the projection of a 40% upper end on postal voting uptake. It may be that we're all feeling as a society that we're moving beyond the most dangerous period of the COVID outbreak, and postal voting uptake may not be significantly higher. But that's not guaranteed, and we do need to be willing to prepare for the possibility that postal voting demand may not only reach 40%, but may exceed it. I'm still concerned about what will happen if government decides, even on the advice of independent electoral administrators, that it's necessary to bring that postal voting deadline even further forward. We could be in a position of turning people away for a postal vote simply because they didn't register early enough. And I am concerned about that possibility. I think we should do everything that we can between now and then to ensure that we maximise the capacity for postal voting so that we can meet whatever demand is created. The public opinion polling that's been conducted that led to that 40% estimate was done at a different time, and we don't know what the circumstances will be between now and then. There's been some discussion about 1- and 2-day elections, and I'll openly say that as a personal view, because I don't think my party has a formal party policy on this, I'm open to the idea of holding elections on multiple days, quite regardless of the current pandemic circumstances. I think there is a good argument that we should be looking at a wide range of options for increasing voter turnout, and having voting on multiple days is one thing that I think should be tried. So I'm reluctant to see it taken out of this bill, even if this bill is specifically designed for these circumstances. I think we should be open to that, but I appreciate the position that the Minister is in saying that a decision on multiple day voting in this election should be based on advice, and that we shouldn't use this as an opportunity to experiment. I do want to put on record, though, that in the longer term, I think the case should be revisited, that elections generally ought to be able to take place on multiple days. The last thing I'll say, Presiding Officer, is that as both Miles Briggs and Anna Sarwar reflected, there are bad lessons to learn from around the world. None of us should want changes to our election arrangements to lead to the kind of fear-mongering and conspiracy theories which we saw in the US. We all have a responsibility, not just in the legislation that we pass, but in the way we conduct our debate between now and then, to demonstrate to the Scottish people that they can have confidence in their election system, and never to lean into the kind of fear-mongering that we've seen used for such unpleasant political ends by the Trump campaign. Thank you.
Colin Liam MacArthur for up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I firstly thank committee members for their efforts in getting witnesses before them and providing us with a report in such a short space of time. Thank the Minister and his officials as well for the consensual way he appears to be approaching this task. As previous speakers have said, the legislation addresses some of the important technical changes that are needed to hold elections in the midst of a pandemic, though I think Patrick Harvey makes a valid point in terms of lessons we might learn more broadly in terms of the holding of elections. The priority, of course, is to keep people safe, but to do so in ways that safeguard our democracy as well. This Parliament has already extended its term by a year, so it's right we commit to ensuring elections go ahead in May, if at all possible. I want to focus on a couple of areas in the bill picked up by the committee. They express concerns about the enormous powers given to ministers to make regulations and trigger changes to elections. I've spoken before in the context of another bill currently before us about how we should be concerned when ministers in a minority government gain monopoly powers to change the rules. I think that's especially true when the rules relate to elections. Many of us have watched on aghast in recent weeks and months as people in the United States have been told their election was being rigged. It's an astonishing state of affairs, one designed to undermine public confidence in the election process and the acceptance of election results. We may be confident it could never happen here, but this bill perhaps provides opportunities to make sure, and those are opportunities that should be seized. The committee commented on the absence of parliamentary scrutiny envisaged by the bill as drafted as, quote, highly unusual and of particular importance. It's a concern I would certainly share. I agree too with the committee's request around the process for converting the election as a last resort to an all-postal election. That seems to me to be a sensible precaution, and I note the Minister's comments in that regard in his opening speech. Likewise, a safeguard should be introduced at stage 2 by including the limited list of possible additional polling days on the face of the bill. On a practical level, if we did have a two-day polling day election, I would suggest that it makes sense to ensure candidates are able to get access to the list of those who have voted at the end of the first day, and this would help reduce unnecessary contact with voters who had already voted. There may even be scope to do that for postal votes received by returning officers prior to polling day. I believe there's precedent for this in the all-postal vote election trials in the North East of England and Yorkshire for the Regional Assembly referendum in the early 2000s. The committee report and witnesses also drew attention to instances where ministers are given enormous power over their own re-election arrangements, something that should certainly have alarm bells ringing. Hopefully steps can be taken at stage 2 to strengthen the scrutiny powers of members in this area. It must not be left to a government alone, particularly a minority government. So the committee is right to ask that Parliament be included in these decisions. We discovered last week that ministers get exclusive access to weekly polling numbers, which no doubt guide its decisions. In the interest, I think, of public confidence, we need to make sure those decisions do not extend to arrangements around elections. Presiding officers, as others have said, this is a bill that none of us would have wished to see, but I think it's entirely right and appropriate that Parliament takes these precautionary steps, and I look forward to the work going to take place under stage 2. And again, thank the committee, the witnesses and the Minister for their efforts today. Thank you.
We'll now hear from Bill Kidd, convener of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. For up to 7 minutes, please, Mr Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm sorry about hurtling in as late as I did. There are still down in the garden lobby children, puppy dogs and television cameramen crammed against the walls as I zoomed past them. But it's very important that I was here. As convener of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, I am pleased to speak in this debate on behalf of the committee. The Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill contains measures which might prove necessary to ensure that the election can go ahead as planned on the 6th of May next year, in the context of restrictions which might be in place due to coronavirus. The bill also contains a backstop measure for delaying the election if circumstances emerge that mean it cannot go ahead. I'm grateful to committee members for working together to produce a unanimous report on the bill, and I acknowledge the experts in the field of running elections who generously gave up their time to inform our scrutiny of the bill. I also welcome the rapid response by the Government to the committee's report. The bill contains a number of provisions, but I would like to highlight some of the main conclusions reached by the committee. As we said in our report, the committee's first priority is to ensure that no voter is unable to vote at the next election. We anticipate that postal voting will play an important role for people who are unable to vote in person due to illness or self-isolation, and postal voting will also ensure that those who may not still feel comfortable going out can still participate. Given the central importance of postal voting to the coming election, we are very keen to ensure that registration for postal votes will not be overwhelmed and that no one misses out. Our report makes a number of recommendations in this regard, including that sufficient contingency must be in place to respond to an unforeseen spike in demand for postal votes, and the early and widespread promotion of the opportunity to register for a postal vote must take place. I'm happy to accept the Government's reassurance that, if necessary, further funds will be made available and further to the additional £3 million already allocated to the electoral registration officers in order to increase the capacity to process applications for postal votes. A two-pronged approach of increasing capacity while at the same time promoting and encouraging take-up of postal voting will be needed to ensure success. I know my colleagues will have more to say about postal voting later in the report, so I will now turn to other matters. The committee was concerned that the power to run an all-postal vote at Section 5 sits with Scottish ministers, and there are no arrangements in the bill for parliamentary scrutiny of such important decisions. We therefore welcome the fact that the Government has indicated in its response to our report to amend the bill at Stage 2 to apply the affirmative procedure to the use of this significant power. The bill allows Scottish ministers at Section 8 to hold polling on multiple days. Our report notes that it is the preference of the electoral community to hold polling over a single day, and the community shares that view. We recognise, however, that preparations for this election are a moving picture, dependent on prevailing virus conditions at the time of the poll. Evaluation being undertaken by the Electoral Management Board on the merits of going down this route will feed into any final decision. We will continue our consideration of this as more information and expert advice becomes available. We welcome the Government's willingness to consider an amendment to the bill to provide certainty over arrangements for the poll. The committee had some concerns about the alteration of the date of dissolution to just 1 day before the election. This will mean that MSPs running for re-election will have a dual role of both candidate and MSP during the campaign period. We have seen the initial guidance emerging from the SPCB to support MSPs during this period. The final suite of guidance will be crucial in maintaining, as far as possible, a level playing field between all candidates, regardless of their status, and to ensure that public resources cannot be used to confer an advantage for some candidates over others. We recognise, however, that there is no perfect solution during such a campaign in such exceptional circumstances. And the committee is particularly concerned that the pre-election recess period should mirror a normal pre-election dissolution period, meaning that the government would be subject to normal purdah restrictions as far as possible. Within that context, we recognise that there will be a need for the government to make announcements in relation to coronavirus, and that scrutiny of these must continue. We note that the current arrangements for enhanced scrutiny of COVID regulations will continue as they are up to the Christmas recess, at which point they will be subject to further review by Parliament. To conclude, Presiding Officer, the Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill proposes measures which should allow the election to go ahead on the 6th of May next year, while we are still living with the virus. The overwhelming concern that we heard from those who contributed to our inquiry was that providing certainty and clarity to the electoral community and to the electorate and political parties at the earliest possible point is essential to ensure the smooth running of the election and to ensure those wishing to vote can do so. We welcome the Government's commitment to keep us informed as we approach the campaign period, and we note the extensive and detailed work with the electoral community and political parties which took place during the Bill's preparation. The provisions in the Bill have been broadly welcomed, and on that basis the Committee was content to recommend to Parliament that the general principles of the Bill be agreed to. Thank you.
We'll now move to the open debate and speeches of no more than 4 minutes, please. I don't have any time in hand. Stuart McMillan, followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, first of all, I welcome this bill and welcome the collective way that the bill has been created. Next year's election, like others have said, will be like no other because of the circumstances. And if anyone thinks that postal voting isn't that important, just very recently, just have to look at the events across the pond and how the postal voting changed the result of that election. And every vote matters, as Bill Kidd MSP would tell you, with his first majority being 7 votes. Postal votes will undoubtedly increase next year, so being prepared for that is essential, and it's also the correct thing to do. The fact that we're having this debate and this bill seems normal and also the right thing to do, and so it should be. But obviously, this Parliament didn't always have the responsibility over our own elections, and the farce of the 2007 election, when Westminster still controlled it and the UK ministers at the time refused to listen to the many voices indicating problems are going to happen because of the new system that's been introduced, speaks volumes. Now, I'm glad, therefore, that a different and more collegiate approach has taken place so far by the Government, but also, crucially, by this Parliament, to try and deal with some of the potential problems that could happen. Now, we had a wide-ranging discussion about the bill and its delegated powers in the DPLR committee, and I welcome the Stage 1 report in front of us today by the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Ultimately, Presiding Officer, we all want every election to run as smoothly as possible, and the organising of any election is a mammoth task, and certainty for the organisers is just as important as it is for the electorate. Now, I welcome the following 3 points in particular. The earlier deadline for postal vote applications of the 6th of April rather than the 20th of April to give more time for these to be processed given expected increases in demand. Secondly, the power for ministers to allow polling to take place over more than 1 day if needed to support the physical distancing at polling stations, and I know also the recommendation in the report by the committee. And thirdly, the measures to defer the election if required. The moving dissolution of Parliament to the 5th of May rather than the 25th of March to ensure MSPs can pass emergency legislation to delay the election. The earlier date for the postal ballot applications, in my opinion, is crucial. The Electoral Commission evidence suggests that 20% of those people who vote on polling day are now more likely to vote by post. If that figure does happen and the 350,000 additional applications do take place, then that earlier date will therefore prove to be a wise decision. I'd be grateful to know, however, if the Minister... Sorry, we only have 4 minutes. I'd be grateful to know, however, if the Minister can confirm that if the application is at the ERO before the closing time on that final date of applications, then it must be processed. And there is a particular reason for me asking that, and I'll happily talk to the Minister about it afterwards. Section 8 of the bill is important also, and something quite different for any election in Scotland. Traditionally, elections take place on a Thursday, as we know, and there are a variety of reasons as to why there are challenges in using particular days for elections. Nonetheless, I welcome the potential increased number of days to hold an election, but I would strongly suggest that if it does happen, then please run the election on consecutive days and not on days with 3 days in between. I would also suggest that do we really need to have, if it's going to be on multiple days, do we really need to have polling stations open from 7 o'clock in the morning to 10 p.m. at night? I generally don't believe that's necessary. Similarly, measures to protect the ballot boxes overnight will be even more crucial, bearing in mind the amount of fake news that does sadly rage online on a wide variety of issues. So, Presiding Officer, I welcome the announcement by the Minister earlier in his discussions with the EMB. However, I think they also need to be clearly communicated to both Parliament and also the electorate to prevent accusations of tampering with the election. Thank you very much.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As ever, can I thank my colleagues on the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee and our clerking team for all their work bringing forward the Stage 1 report. This pandemic has brought significant changes to how we as elected politicians carry out our duties. And members from across this chamber will have had to make difficult decisions about how to represent our constituents as best we can while ensuring safety. Public meetings and constituency surgeries over video call, a greater dependence on written communication. And for those who are candidates in next year's elections, campaigning has clearly changed too. Although it is difficult to foresee where we'll be in May, what is clear is that the election will be impacted. And in many ways it already has been. After all, an election is far more than a single event. The regulated period begins on the 6th of January, just as this Parliament returns from the Christmas recess. And when we consider safety, it's not only about the limited number of people who are involved in campaigns or electoral administration. It's about the millions of activists and count staff and poll staff and the electors themselves. The Parliament finds itself in an unenviable position. On one hand, a pandemic is unpredictable, yet for the election to function effectively, we have a need for as much certainty as possible in advance. And the Electoral Commission has been clear about the problems that can be caused by last-minute changes, and we must be mindful of that. The bill creates wide powers to make alterations to the electoral process. Many of them, used sensibly, will find agreement across this chamber. We all recognise the gravity of the situation that we face. That being said, it's not for this Parliament to pass wide-ranging powers to the executive on the basis of trust and the hope that good sense will always prevail. Now, I approve of the broad principles of the bill, and it's essential that a bill of this nature is passed. But I do share, and I have shared concerns of other members of my party, that significant powers, such as implementing an all-postal ballot or voting over a 2-day period, are too broad to be reasonably handed to ministers. These types of steps would be unprecedented, and it is important that we get legislative underpinning right. And so I do welcome the comments of the Minister today on this and the tone in which ministers have taken this forward so far. The Stage 1 report also highlights some of the practical issues that we face. The assumptions around postal voting, expected uptake, capacity and relevant deadlines are all serious concerns. We all rightly start from a point where no one legally entitled should be denied the opportunity to have their vote recorded. One issue that we've raised is the need for proper resourcing of this election, and as the Minister has recognised, it will cost more than usual. And so at all levels, the resource must be available to allow for flexibility. The committee has also requested that ministers provide it with regular updates of the work, its work, and I hope that that does take place. Presiding Officer, in many ways we should need no reminding that confidence in our electoral system is as important as functioning effectively. We've seen, sadly too often, where a lack of confidence or confusion has caused significant problems for elections and referendums in terms of recognition and legitimacy. More than ever, we need a well-considered approach and as much consensus as possible in moving forward. There will be questions for later stages of this bill, and I'm confident that the issues that exist can be improved on. As the committee acknowledged, opportunities for scrutiny of this bill have been limited by time. Similarly, the choices this bill provides may be pressured by the circumstances we face. I would therefore urge ministers to be flexible, to ensure that by stage 3 we have a bill that is watertight, and to make sure that we are best placed for any problems that the pandemic may throw at us along the road. Thank you.
Maureen Watt, followed by Gil Patterson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Democracy is very precious, and elections at regular intervals underpin that democracy. Democracy doesn't just happen or endure, it has to be active and protected, and regular, open and free elections, in our case every 5 years, is one of the ways in which this is done. I wish we didn't need this bill, but the present worldwide pandemic does require this government and this Parliament to take precautionary measures. Hopefully, the advent of a vaccine will negate the need, for example, to use the power to postpone the election, but even the rollout of the vaccine will probably not have covered everyone by the beginning of May, so extra measures must be in place to cover every eventuality prior to the election. I have the privilege of sitting on the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, which took evidence on this bill and published this Stage 1 report, which I hope Parliament will support at decision time. I think for many politicians and party activists, the issue of postal votes and all postal voting must now be pretty high on their agenda. We heard from electoral registration officers some months ago that their offices would not be able to deal with all-wide postal vote, an all-wide postal vote in an election. And I understand that. However, like Patrick Harvey, I do think they're somewhat unambitious to say that they can only cope with 40% of votes being postal. But having said that, evidence from recent by-elections is interesting. In my own constituency, we had a by-election in the Kincorthnig and Cove ward a few weeks ago. The turnout was 27%, which is not too unusual for recent council by-elections. But interestingly, and as far as I can gather, the majority of ballots cast were postal. But also interesting, there was not a great surge in postal vote applications, but those who had already registered for a postal vote must have been more likely to return them. So I think it's incumbent in all politicians and their parties to always work for as maximum a turnout as possible, and therefore to give the opportunity to vote by post to all those who want it. And I hope also that the government will, through media campaigns, also promote the opportunity that people have to vote by post. It's for this reason I completely understand why the EROs want postal vote applications to be with them 3 weeks out from the election. They will have to check the validity of the postal vote, send out the ballots, and then conduct rigorous checks on them, particularly the signatures, when they are returned. The confidence of the electorate on this is vital, and as others have mentioned, as we've seen across the pond, the availability to make mischief and mayhem on this has not been lost on us on this side of the pond. I do hope, however, that sufficient guidelines will be given for emergency postal and proxy votes due to illness or work commitments abroad or other events. And perhaps the Minister can say more about this in his closing remarks. Presiding Officer, I do hope that as many electors as possible will opt to apply for a postal vote, and that there's no need for polling in person to happen over 2 days. I understand that election managers are prepared to introduce more polling stations within polling places, but I hope this is thought through in relation to each polling place so that there are not queues within the corridors or outside, given the vagaries of Scottish weather. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Gil Patterson, followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you much, Presiding Officer. The Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill is a vitally important piece of legislation in these difficult and unpredictable times, which will ensure in all circumstances that our democratic process is protected and next year's elections are fair and seen to be fair. The bill, in my view, quite comprehensive, and addresses most eventualities and makes sensible provisions for unexpected events and issues raised by the pandemic as we progress, hopefully, through the disease's final stages. I'm particularly pleased in how responsive the Scottish Government has been to issues raised by the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee, and that everyone has galvanised together to ensure the legislation is in place in time. And I think the Minister has been very responsive to the calls from the committee. As a result of our experiences of the coronavirus pandemic so far, many aspects of our lives from now on will have changed dramatically, and in the way things were done in the past may not be appropriate anymore. The advent of an increasing use of postal voting, I have no doubt, will increase quite markedly, and next year's Scottish general election. And it is gratifying that issues surrounding uptake, funding, voter registration, and adequate timeframes to service voters, and of course advertisement of postal voting procedures have been investigated with those responsible for the conducting of the election. With expert opinions suggesting that 38% of the electorate might choose to use a postal vote in next year's election, the provision of 50% within the bills seems adequately provided, an adequately provided contingency should the surge be greater than anticipated. And of course that we should keep a watching brief on that as matters progress. Although unlikely, Section 5 of the bill, which provides ministers with the powers to call an all-postal ballot, will be amended to allow parliamentary scrutiny at stage 2, which I think is the proper thing to do. Since the pre-election period timeframes will be different next year, as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, and that dissolution of Parliament will not now take place until the 5th of May 2021. It is hugely important that sitting MSPs, and I'm not one of them, who are also candidates, do not get an unfair advantage over other candidates in the run-up to the election. It is gratifying indeed that the government support the committee's recommendation on this democratic issue, as they do in relation to observing normal public restrictions during the pre-election period. The committee raised the question of polling being held over more than one day, should circumstances in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic dictate that it would be safer to do so, and that issues surrounding logistics and amendments concerning parliamentary scrutiny are currently being considered by the Scottish Government. We're grateful for that. Issues around scrutiny time for the passage of the bill have also been raised, but the necessity to have the legislation in place in time precludes my concerns, and I accept the Scottish Government's response as reasonable, where they acknowledge the limited amount of time available to scrutinise the bill, and will work with members on any proposals. And I think the Minister has already proven that to be the case. I'm pleased that the committee are satisfied that the policy memorandums accurately describes the policy objectives of the bill,
come to a close,
and that the Scottish Government acknowledges concerns expressed by Sight Scotland and Age Scotland from the memorandum section of equal opportunities and human rights. All in all, I support the passage of the Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill in these extremely challenging times at stage 2. Thank you.
Neil Findlay, followed by John McAlpine.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have very serious concerns about our democracy. If we look at the last 20 years of Scottish politics, it's easy to swallow some of the mythology that surrounds our democracy and elections to this Parliament. There is a myth that the creation of the Parliament brought about huge democratic renewal excuse me, and a political reawakening of the Scottish electorate, where people became much more engaged with politics, Parliament and our political system, and we often hear references to the Scottish Parliament being far more relevant and in touch with the people in Westminster, and that somehow we are better, morally superior and democratically superior and more relevant to the daily lives of the people we claim to represent. But I think we really should question, are we? If we look at turnout elections to this Parliament, we can see that in 2016 only 55% of voters turned out to vote. Almost half of our citizens felt so ambivalent that they could not bring themselves to vote for anyone. Turnouts at Scottish elections have never been higher than 58%. The local government election in 2012 was 39%, 46% in 2017, way behind the 68% at the 2019 UK general election. The irony is that the closer politics appears to get to the people, the less engagement there appears to be with it. Indeed, I would contend that many of my constituents who sleep just out there on the streets and in the doorways of the Royal Mail feel just as remote from democracy and this Parliament as, say, someone living in the Shetlands does from the Westminster Parliament. This is not a good state of affairs. It's not evidence of a healthy democracy. However, we are in unprecedented times, and we will be going through an election during a time of national crisis. So it's essential more than ever that systems are in place, not only to ensure the election is run in a fair and transparent way, but that we engage the maximum number of voters to take part with systems and procedures that can carry the confidence of the public. My fellow committee members have raised many of the issues that we discussed during the evidence sessions. But that assumption that the election planners made of a 40% postal vote figure, I think, was evidence of a real conservatism within in them and their ambition. I see the Minister has increased the budget to 50%, the budget to try and take that up to 50%. And that's a very good thing, but I don't think that should be the end of our ambition. And I think one way to do that is by having a national free post address that anyone can just write postal vote, free post, and it would get there on an envelope. It would get there. Because this would make it applying free and simple and easy, with no barriers, especially for those groups that we know are hard to engage or are disenfranchised in so many different ways. This would, and promoting that through multiple platforms with a concerted effort to reach those groups and those geographical locations, those constituencies we know that have very low levels of voter participation. That would be a way in which we can get that number up from those very poor voting figures that we see. I think we should consider the election over more than one day, but that should be a choice and a decision made by Parliament, not ministers. And I think we should not put any limitations on the postal vote period that restricts people's ability to vote. Presiding Officer, any communications that come out about elections have to come from a neutral body. They just simply have to come. And I would suggest the electoral registration offices or the Chief Returning Officer or whoever. If it can't come from that, then maybe the Minister can explain. I may be ignorant of that, and if I am, I apologise for that. If it is the NHS, then, well, I would consider that. But we must recognise the Chief Medical Officer is a political appointment, and I don't make that as any criticism of him. It's just the reality. So I don't think we should be attempting, in even the smallest way, bringing people like that into the political process.
Joan McAlpine, to be followed by John Scott.
Thank you very much. The right to vote is perhaps one of our most fundamental rights as citizens. As we prepare for an election in the context of the pandemic, it's imperative that we ensure the safety of everyone who exercises their right to vote in May. At the start of 2020, most of us would not have predicted that by the end of March we'd be under a national lockdown. The COVID-19 outbreak has impacted nearly all areas of public life, and at this stage it's obvious that we must take innovative measures to safeguard our electoral processes. The Scottish Government has been clear about its expectation for the election to be held on the 6th of May 2021 as scheduled, but I'm pleased that the Government has also been clear on why the election might be postponed. If we find ourselves facing a lockdown where voting at polling places would be unsafe, it would require the Scottish Government to postpone the election. Although it's highly unlikely that the election would need to be postponed, it's critical that we have the necessary legislation in place so that we can come prepared. That is why the bill moves the dissolution of Parliament to the 5th of May 2021, which would allow for MSPs to pass emergency legislation to defer the election if necessary. This, in my view, is a logical change, as there's potential for there to be a spike in coronavirus cases, which could make it unsafe to cast our ballots on the 6th of May. By shortening the dissolution period to just 1 day, we would avoid a potential situation in which the Parliament would be unable to make a vital decision to protect voters and minimise transmission of the virus. The bill will also give ministers the power to make regulations to allow polling to take place over several days to support social distancing and additional hygiene measures at polling stations, as in-person voting may ultimately take longer. Under this provision, voting must commence on election day. However, it could be extended in the 8 days immediately following. The bill sets out to bring the deadline for postal vote applications, as has been said, forward by 2 weeks. This is another logical step, in my view, that we should be taking. Research conducted by the Electoral Commission in August 2020 found that we could see an additional 350,000 people opting to vote by post in this election. Postal vote applications require thorough checking and verification, which takes time. Therefore, it only makes sense that we bring the deadline forward to ensure enough time for all the applications to be processed. Next year's election will be of monumental importance in Scotland's political history. It will be an election that, at its heart, will be about democracy and self-determination. The administrative challenge of running any election is significant. The pandemic has made it all the more challenging. That is why we must do everything we can to ensure that our parliamentary election next year is as safe and as fair as possible. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Move to John Scott, please, to be followed by Shona Robson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I begin by welcoming the rollout of the vaccination programme against COVID-19, which started on Tuesday and which represents a paradigm shift in the need for this Scottish General Election coronavirus bill. However, we do, of course, still need to plan for the worst-case scenarios and not drop our guard until the vaccination programme is complete. But we can, I think, approach this bill in a slightly more relaxed way than when the need for it was first recognised. So firstly, we welcome the Government's offer to increase the capacity to deal with postal vote applications up to 50%, although it now seems less likely that this will be required. And we agree with the Scottish Government approach, as outlined by the Minister in his opening remarks and his letter, about the postage costs of postal votes, and that this should be covered by political parties. That more people will indeed use postal votes than before is certain, but I would expect that total to be between 30 and 40% or less in light of the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccination programme. Turning to Section 5 of the bill, and again I welcome the Government giving way and agreeing that an affirmative instrument would be required in the now unlikely event that an all-postal vote ballot would be required. I welcome the fact that in the Minister's response to the Stage 1 report, it is proposed that Parliament, through an affirmative instrument, would now have a vote to decide on such a dramatic change to our voting system, which an all-postal ballot would be, and the recognition that such a significant power to move to an all-postal vote ballot should not be a decision that rested entirely with Scottish Government ministers. Turning now to the role of candidates while still MSPs with the new dissolution date of the 4th of May, I welcome the SPCB detailed guidance on this published on the 1st of December and look forward to seeing this guidance being further developed and updated in the run-up to the election. Looking now to Section 8 regarding polling on additional days, we do not believe this is necessary, and note that the Election Management Board do not either, in their helpful note issued today, and from which I quote, "On the basis of this analysis, it is the view of the EMB that polling over a single day should be sufficient, provided that returning officers review and limit the numbers of voters allocated to each polling station, communicate that voters should prepare to plan their visit and be prepared for a short wait, and put in place measures within polling stations, such as the employment of additional staff to advise and reassure voters and to maintain the flow of voters through the polling station." The EMB also report that polling over multiple days, in their view, introduces additional risk. I beg your pardon. The EMB also reports that polling over multiple days, in their views, introduces additional risk, cost and potential confusion for the voter. And given the now likely effects of vaccination against COVID-19 and the expected uptake in postal votes, which will significantly reduce the number of voters attending polling stations, our view was and remained that polling should be over one day. Further, we do not believe this power should be vested in Scottish ministers alone, and we believe that, as at Section 5, that such a power should only be taken through an affirmative instrument, thereby giving the Parliament a vote on this. Again, at Section 11, which gives the PO the power to postpone an election, I note that there is apparently no obligation on him to consult Parliament on this decision. And again, I believe that such an obligation should exist in law, always accepting that the power given to the PO, as proposed, would only be used as a position of last resort. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we will support this bill at Stage 1, subject to amendments being brought forward as discussed at Sections 5 and 8, and I look forward to the Minister's comments in this regard.
And the last of the open debate contributions is from Shona Robson.
Deputy Presiding Officer, as others have said, that the right to vote is a key part of our democracy, so it's important that we safeguard this, despite the obvious challenges of the pandemic that have been referred to during this debate. Can I welcome the comments and announcements made by the Minister today, not least the announcement that there will be a public awareness campaign on postal votes. I think that's very welcome indeed. As others have referred to, one of the key issues highlighted is that there's the potential for a significant increase in the proportion of registered voters who choose to apply to vote by post, as they are unable or don't wish to vote in person at the election. And of course, the Electoral Commission research carried out in August found that 20% of those who generally vote at a polling place would prefer to vote by post if an election were to take place at this point, understandably, given concerns about the pandemic. And this indicates the potential for approximately 350,000 people who would have voted at a polling station instead opting to vote by post. That's a lot of people and clearly a logistical challenge. This significant increase in the volume of applications would need to be managed by electoral registration officers at an already busy time in the electoral timetable. In order to mitigate this, one of the main provisions of the bill is to provide for an earlier deadline for applications to vote by post, which would help the officers by giving them more time to process any surge in applications, thereby ensuring that those voters who applied by the deadline have their application processed in time to be issued with a postal ballot pack. Returning officers would also have more time to prepare for the issuing of postal ballot packs as soon as practicable after the close of nominations, maximising the time available for voters to complete and return them before the close of poll. Given the anticipated increase in postal votes, this is one aspect of the legislation that we absolutely need to get right, and the bill proposes to bring the postal vote application deadline forward to the 6th of April 2021, which is 21 working days prior to the election. I think an important point is that the voting options really need to be the same for all, and the discrepancy in dates between registration and application for postal voting obviously is an issue, and I hope this is something that will be clarified going forward, as this could have an impact on young and first-time voters who we wish to encourage to become involved in the democratic process and avoid any possibility of turning them off to the process. And as the mum of a 17-year-old who has a very passing interest in politics, I think it is very important that that doesn't happen. So one suggestion would be to provide an exemption or extension to the proposed 6th of April deadline for postal votes for those first-time registered voters, and perhaps the government and committee may wish to look at that. I understand that electors who missed the earlier postal vote application deadline would, however, have the option of applying to appoint a proxy up to the deadline of the 27th of April. And although that has the potential to shift the stress on administration to a different point in the timetable and closer to the poll, it still raises the issue of creating different criteria to voting and not providing equal choice for all. The main objective, however, must be to ensure that voters have early and clear information about the postal vote application deadline to ensure that they can make an informed choice about their method of voting to help them plan how to vote safely. I certainly welcome the consensus in this debate and look forward to seeing how it progresses. Thank you.
Move now to the closing speeches. First of all, Anna Sarwar for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I'll pick up on the point that Shona Robertson finished up on there, which is the importance of consensus in this debate. As I say, if we are to get public trust for the elections, this cannot be a contentious process, has to be a contentious one. I'm sure all of us on all sides would want to commit to that. As was said by John Scott, Miles Briggs and Liam MacArthur and several others, this has to be ultimately a decision for Parliament to take rather than just government, and I hope that is a spirit of partnership that Parliament and all parties in Parliament will have with the government. Just to summarise a few points with the Minister, it would be good to get clarification from the Minister about the budget gap around the 3 million that he stated in the opening remarks and the 5 million in the financial framework. I hope there's no gap, and I'm pleased that he's able to confirm that no gap. Nodding, I'm sure he can say that in his actual contribution as well. Also on the postal vote deadline, I think Patrick Harvey made the point. I think Miles Briggs made the point, and others made the point too. Again, repeat, it does feel counterintuitive for us to be changing that postal vote deadline to make it earlier when we want to increase and expand the accessibility to vote. And that's why I would ask the Minister to think again about that part of the bill, and if we can mitigate some of the fears that might come from a late flow of applications from the booklet process and the public information campaign and what's associated with that in terms of trying to get some early applications into that process. Alongside that, I think the issue of free post is an important one. I note the Minister said that a booklet would be going to every household, letting them know about their rights to apply for a postal vote. There is no reason why, as part of that booklet going to every household, we can't include an application for every household and indeed a free post response mechanism for an application for every household. So a response to that would be good from the Minister. As Bill Kidd touched upon, it's important that we have an effective public information campaign. So it'd be good to know when that public information campaign was going to begin and in whose name that public information campaign is going to be. I think it is important that is. I realise the Minister is rolling his eyes at that suggestion. I'm sorry that's the reason for the Minister to roll his eyes. I think it's important that any communication in relation to the administration of the election or any application process for the election, let me finish my point and I'm happy to take the Minister, it comes from a naturally neutral source, not a participant in the election. So whether that's any advert, any booklet, any letter, it should come from a neutral source. I'm happy to take the Minister.
If I can offer some alleviation of Mr Sarwar's paranoia, we are working extremely closely with the Electoral Commission, who will be the source of the information campaigns, both in terms of accessing postal votes, but also calming people's concerns about the process of postal votes and addressing some of the nonsense out there about the security of the system.
Well, I agree. I don't think we want anyone to be paranoid, and that's why it's important to have the clarification from the government that any publication would come from a neutral source. And if there's any paranoia, perhaps is on the side of the Minister, because I don't think it should be difficult for him to confirm that any such public information campaign or booklet or letter would come from a neutral source. And just on that point, I realise that he was suggesting that the CMO would write to the shielding category. Again, I'm open to that suggestion, but again, would urge that communication come from an NHS Scotland perspective rather than from a Scottish Government perspective, from that very same purpose of it being communications not directly from the Scottish Government or branded with the Scottish Government. And the final issue around that is around the 1 day. I thought Patrick Harvey made a really good point, which is there's an argument to extend the number of days, regardless of whether we have a pandemic or not, if we want to maximise the turnout and maximise participation. So in many ways, this could be a good trial using the opportunities that I'm happy to take Liam MacArthur's intervention.
Liam MacArthur.
Sawa for giving way. Like him, I was very interested in the point Patrick Harvey was making, and this is an area where I think we can probably learn from what happens in other countries who already have elections that span over at least a couple of days.
Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, and I think that's something that we should explore. So fine where we end up on the final wording of the bill around 1 day, but I think we should keep the option of additional days, and fundamentally that should be for the Parliament to decide rather than for the government to decide, and I think that's a fundamental principle that we want to go on. I note Stuart McMillan's point around the hours. I think that's also an interesting point that is worthy of exploration. On all of these issues, I hope we can find some consensus in the coming week or two and find a bill that has the unanimous support of this Parliament.
Call Adam Tompkins for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This bill is fine, sensible and pragmatic, with 2 exceptions. And in my closing remarks this evening, I want to focus on those exceptions, leaving the remainder of the bill to one side. 2 provisions of this bill are unacceptable in their present form, sections 5 and 8, and each for the same reason. Both these provisions give ministers far too much power. Under section 5, they could provide for the next election to this Parliament to be an all-postal ballot. Under section 8, they could provide for polling at the next election to take place on a variety of different days within a specified 8-day period. And let me say straight away that in the light of the coronavirus pandemic, it is sensible to build into our electoral law flexibility about postal ballots and flexibility about the day or days of polling. But on no account is it either fair, reasonable, proportionate, or necessary to place all of that flexibility unchecked into the hands of ministers. Ministers are participants in the election, they cannot at the same time be its referees. So in both cases, both with regard to section 5 and as regards section 8, substantive and procedural checks need to be added over the amending stages in order to make these provisions acceptable. Let me set out exactly what I have in mind. As regards section 5, the Standards and Procedures Committee in its stage 1 report notes that the power to provide for an all-postal ballot is a contingent measure in the event that an in-person vote proves impossible with COVID. And the Minister said the same in his opening remarks. Fine. But if that's the case, why does the bill not so provide? As it stands, the power to provide for an all-postal ballot can be exercised for any reason, or indeed for no reason at all, and at any time. There's no requirement that the power be exercised only because otherwise no election to this place could safely be held. If this is a contingent power to be used only as a last resort, the bill needs to say so in terms. The Standards and Procedures Committee notes that an all-postal ballot cannot be organised in time for an election in May. The committee records this statement in the bill's policy memorandum that such a move would necessitate at least a 6-month delay to the election. It is, for these reasons, highly unlikely to happen. But lots of highly unlikely things have happened this year, and the fact that the exercise of this power is unlikely is, I'm afraid, simply not good enough. The bill must be amended clearly to set out the extremely limited circumstances in which it would be lawful for ministers by order to require the election to become an all-postal ballot. And even then, concerns remain. No provision is made in section 5 for any parliamentary input into this matter. Ministers are given a blank cheque. Well, sorry, Presiding Officer, but no self-respecting parliament should ever sign such an instrument. Yes, section 5 provides that you, Presiding Officer, that the Electoral Commission and that the convener of the Electoral Management Board and indeed also the Chief Medical Officer are consulted, but that's it, just consulted. Not that you or their consent is required, still less that this Parliament's consent is required. And this will not do. The power in section 5 must be amended so that it may be exercised only after you, Presiding Officer, and the Electoral Commission and the convener of the EMB have consented to it being exercised. In addition, it must be further amended to ensure that no such order-making power can be exercised other than with the assent of this Parliament, that is, under the affirmative procedure. Now, what goes for section 5, Presiding Officer, must go also for section 8. Like the power to provide for an all-postal ballot, so too must the power to provide for polling on multiple days be constrained both substantively and procedurally. This power should be exercisable only where shown to be necessary, because polling cannot safely take place on a single day. And further, the power should be exercisable only with your consent, presiding officer, and with the consent of the Electoral Commission and the convener of the Electoral Management Board. And finally, that power too must be subject to the affirmative procedure. These checks on ministerial rulemaking are essential, presiding officer. They are fair, reasonable, proportionate and necessary checks, which we require to see in place to satisfy not only ourselves, but much more importantly, the voting public, that the next election to this Parliament meets the highest standards of fairness and voting integrity. Nothing should allow us to compromise those standards, not even COVID. So we will support the general principles of the bill tonight, but our support is conditional. Sections 5 and 8 of the bill will need to be amended, as I have set out. The integrity of the voting system is too precious to risk. Now, I know Graham Day agrees with that, and I look forward to working with him and indeed across all the parties in this Parliament to fix this bill's defects at stage 2. Thank you.
Now calling Graham Day to close this debate for up to 7 minutes. Please, Minister.
Presiding Officer, thank you. This has been a thoughtful debate, and I thank members for all their contributions. I've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to move straight on to responding to as many of these as I possibly can. I want to start with Aaron Tompkins. I'm happy to consider his ask for clarity around the circumstances in which the use of the power would be used. But I'm disappointed that he seemed to miss my earlier comments that I'm prepared to bring an amendment that goes beyond the ask of the DPLR committee and takes account of the informative procedure. He talked about a similar approach to Section 8. I earlier indicated to John Scott that I was happy to discuss that with Mr Scott. But I would just caution that the circumstances in which the power under Section 8 might have to be used might be more pressing, more immediately needed. So we would have to be very careful if we did that about the nature of the procedure that was to be followed. A number of members talked about communicating change to the electors, and I agree with that. So I want to outline this in a bit of detail. We are currently working with partners, the Electoral Commission, the Electoral Management Board, and within that, the Electoral Registration Office, to provide consistent and coordinated communications to electors. And that will include informing vulnerable or higher risk groups about how to apply for alternative voting methods. The Electoral Commission have partnered as well with the Care Inspectorate to send out communications to all registered care providers in Scotland about supporting residents to register and to apply for a postal vote. The Commission is also working with with the Age Scotland, the Citizens Advice Service, One Parent Family Scotland and the voluntary sector to reach out to older people's forums to get the information to them. But I don't accept the premise that I think Anna Sarwar advanced earlier, that if you do all this early enough, you could get to the point where you could restore the deadline, the existing deadline for postal votes. I want to be clear on this. The action that we are proposing is based upon very firm advice from the electoral professionals, and we can talk about them being unambitious or conservative, but I think we need to be guided by the professionals. And this is all about smoothing a peak, avoiding a situation where we get too close to... No, I would rather press on, if I may, because I've got a lot to cover. It's about avoiding a situation where there is a surge so close to the election that it becomes difficult or impossible for the electoral authorities to process the ballot packs, get them out. We want to ensure that people do not miss out on their vote if they've applied for a postal vote. And it is not about simply throwing more resource at this. These conversations have been had with the electoral authorities. No, if you don't mind, I do need to press on. We cannot, as I say, risk the situation where the postal votes become problematic. Now, as was acknowledged by Neil Finlay, we've talked a lot about doubling the postal vote number, but he's right. We're talking about a number between 40% and 50%. That's what the resourcing is going into. And if we get to a situation, as we are progressing, that it becomes apparent, as some have indicated, that we might see these numbers exceeded, then of course we will look at additional resource where that's appropriate earlier on. I'm sorry, I do want to cover this in fairness to everybody. On the subject of postal vote costs, a substantial degree of assistance is already provided to persons voting by post. Each postal vote is already cast at no cost to the individual voter using a first-class addressed envelope supplied by the returning officer. And in relation to electoral registration, EROs currently enclose a prepaid envelope with any invitation to register and also with subsequent reminders. And of course, EROs also issue prepaid envelopes to all postal vote application forms that they send out. So every voter who engages with a local ERO is covered here. The only time a voter would face costs of this nature is where they may have downloaded a form from the Electoral Commission website, completed it and sent it in, or where a political party has issued postal vote forms to them. Now, I think what's key here is that interaction between the local ERO and the local voter. And that's where we come to, and I know it's a well-intended suggestion about a national free post address. My questions that would arise from that is, who handles the application? Who gets these postal vote forms out to the relevant ERO? The last thing we can afford is having a centralised system and possibly, I say possibly, someone who's sought a postal vote misses out because it doesn't get passed on in time or to the right place. As we know, these things can happen. Anna Sarwar's point about £3 million for EROs, I'm pleased to say there is no budget gap at all. The £3 million was the sum that the EROs asked for originally up front. The remaining money is there to match any actual spend. And beyond that, we have committed that if there are further evidence costs that arise from that, then of course we will engage on those. Patrick Harvey had a plea about not bringing forward the postal vote deadline any further than it's proposed to be brought forward. In actual fact, the provision in the bill would be to move it closer to polling day only. And as I say, I made the point earlier, we're talking about having the ambition to raise the postal vote element of this election up to somewhere around 50%. And as others have pointed out, in 2016, the actual vote was 55%. So we are showing ambition here. We are catering for the hope that there will be a bigger than usual turnout in this election. Stuart McMillan touched on this issue about the plea that if the election was held over more than one day, it was successive days. That is the ask of the EMB. They've been very clear on that, and I'm very sympathetic to that point. Bill Kidd talked about the Purdah period. Absolutely, the Scottish Government will be subject to the usual Purdah restrictions, but in the same way MSPs will operate in the way that they would have normally done anyway. But just because this is termed an election recess, it is in effect, other than for the point about being able to come back and vote, a dissolution period. However, to be clear with members, the Bureau has been looking at the possibility and what we would do if, during the pandemic had perhaps heightened, the Scottish Government was still having to make decisions about levels, and they were significant decisions, then how would the Parliament scrutinise that? So that is still an ongoing conversation. But that is actually, and Miles Briggs is aware of this, the only dispensation, if you like, from the period or the approach that we're talking about. And I sincerely apologise to members whose points I haven't responded to. Presiding Officer, whilst this bill has had to be brought forward at an accelerated pace, I'm pleased that it's attracted wide-ranging support from stakeholders and generally in the Chamber today. And I hope that members will join me in supporting the principles of this important and necessary bill.
That concludes the debate on the Scottish General Election Coronavirus Bill, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business. Please take care, anyone who's moving about or leaving the chamber, to maintain social distancing.